And the Gospel of Matthew reads, "And the earth quaked, the rocks rent, and the graves of the saints were opened. And when he arose, 3 days and 3 nights later, the saints in the graves arose and appeared to many in the streets of Jerusalem." Wait just a minute. Why is it giving the whole punchline? He just said, "It is finished." He just died. And then the next statement is, "And the earthquake, the graves were open, and when he arose, they arose," is giving us a punchline that he's going to rise 3 days and 3 nights later. And when he arises, there will be those who were in the graves, which were opened when the earthquake and the rocks rent, that they will be raised and appear to many in the streets of Jerusalem. Why is this statement there?
Now it does fit for Matthew and Mark, as it says, "The veil of the temple was rent in two from top to bottom." Mark also has it right here. "The veil of the temple was rent in two from top to bottom." And this is where I'll put in from Luke, even though it was mentioned earlier. "And the veil of the temple was rent in the midst." Right after that, only in Matthew does it mention there were bodies of the saints which slept arose and came out of the graves after his resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many. It does say right there, after his resurrection. So this is like a mention of what is going to happen later. It's just connected to the fact that Jesus died because it's part of the same ceremony, if you will.
Matthew tells us at the end of the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the sepulcher, and the angel said, "You're too late, ladies. He's already gone." When did he get up? Does the scripture tell us when he got up? Yes, it does. In Leviticus 23, it tells us exactly when he got up. This is how it works. Yeshua was crucified on Wednesday. Right when the Passover lambs were being sacrificed on the Temple Mount, he was hanging on the cross. When the lambs were taken off the Temple Mount and put in the ovens, late in the afternoon, Yeshua was taken off the cross and put in the grave. He was in the grave just before sundown on Wednesday. Let's say that sundown was 6 o'clock that year. It wasn't. Let's just say it was. And so we're going to say that Yeshua was put in the grave at 5:30, a half hour before sundown. Now, I know this is fiction. I'm just making this up because we're not told exactly what moment he's put in. But I want to use this as an example, okay? He's put in the grave at 5:30 because sundown is at 6 o'clock. He is in the grave just before sundown. So he's in the grave all Wednesday night, because now when the sun sets, it begins the high Sabbath of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So he is in the grave all Wednesday night, all Thursday night, all Friday night. He is in the grave all day Thursday, because this whole time period is a high Sabbath. He is in the grave all day Friday, and he's in the grave all day Saturday, and he is raised before sundown at 5:30 before the end of the Sabbath. The Lord of the Sabbath is raised on the Sabbath. Now the women come the next morning at the time of the rising of the sun, and the grave is already empty. He is already risen. So I ask you, do the scriptures tell us when he arose from the dead? Yes, they do. And it all has to do with the very reason that we always Keep the feast of Passover and unleavened bread in the month of the Aviv barley. Because if you do not do this right, you will never be able to count to 3. And this is the reason that the Pharisees changed the counting of the Omer, and they changed the day of the Bikurim after the destruction of the temple. And so now on the modern Jewish calendar, many times you'll see the Pharisee reckoning and the Zadokim, or the priest of Zadok reckoning, because they know that they changed it. They changed it deliberately so that no one could understand that Yeshua fulfilled this very picture. And this is the picture. On Wednesday, we're just going to take any year. Not this year, we're just going to take any single year. Okay? When the Passover lambs were sacrificed on the Temple Mount, the last one that was sacrificed was the one that was selected by the high priest. When that lamb was sacrificed, the high priest, after all this work, with all the priests working and singing the psalm together, he would then wet his lips, and then he would make a final proclamation, "It is finished." The lambs were then taken off the Temple Mount and put in the ovens. The high priest and his entourage of priests would take their lambs and take them down into a chamber in the Temple Mount in Mount Moriah and would put them in the ovens in the priest's chamber. Literally in Mount Moriah, the mountain where Yahweh will be our more, or teacher. And then, after they put the lambs in the oven, it's still later in the afternoon, and the high priest will then lead an entourage of priests off the Temple Mount over the Kidron Valley Bridge, where they will then be over the Kidron Valley Bridge on the side of the Mount of Olives, where the priest planted the barley for the first fruit offering. To this very day, the entire side of the Mount of Olives is covered with barley that continues to volunteer year after year, century after century. From when the priest planted it, it's still growing there today. As they were going over the Kidron Valley Bridge, down below them were the graves of the kings and the patriarchs. Over to the right are thousands and thousands of graves over to the right. Today, it's the largest cemetery in the world, the most expensive real estate on the planet. Everyone wants to be first up on Resurrection Day, so you pay a lot for that privilege. The priest go over the bridge, and then the Levites will then bind together 10 standing shocks of barley. They don't cut it. They bind the barley together, still rooted in the ground. They put a cord around it, and they do 10 standing shocks of 1 omer apiece. Then they leave them in that condition, bound together, still standing. They go back across the Kidron Valley Bridge. They go down into Mount Moriah, and there, when the sun sets and the lamb is roasted, they will then eat the Passover lamb with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, and the high priest stays in the mountain in seclusion until the end of the weekly Sabbath. And this is what happens at the end of the weekly Sabbath. Listen very carefully. The high priest will then leave the Temple Mount with a large entourage of priests, and several of these priests will have baskets in their hands and sickles in their hands. Just after the sun sets, at the end of the weekly Sabbath, because now we can go back to work when the sun sets at the end of the Sabbath, that is when the entourage of priests goes over the Kidron Valley Bridge, and the high priest stands and asks the question to all of the priests that are present. And the high priest says, "Has the sun set?" The priests look up into the sky, and because they're on the side of the Mount of Olives, you can't tell exactly when the sun is set. But if you can look up and you can see 3 stars, you know that the sun has gone down past the horizon and the sky is dark enough so they know the sun has set. And then the priest would then cut those standing shocks of barley in the darkness. Remember, it was bound together in the light. Now the sun is set, and they then harvest that barley. They put the barley in their baskets, carry it back across the Kidron Valley Bridge to the Temple Mount, where they then, if the barley is not quite completely dried yet, then they will parch it in fire. They will separate the wheat from the chaff. They will then grind the barley and then make it into loaves and bake it. And in the morning, the high priest will then take those barley loaves into the holy place and wave them before the Holy of Holies as the offering of the bikurim, the first fruits of the barley. That is in Leviticus chapter 23. So, when was Yeshua raised from the dead? This is what the Gospels tell us. When Yeshua knew his hour was come, he said, I thirst. What is this hour that was come? When the last Passover lamb was sacrificed. He then wet his mouth, and he pulled up against those nails and pushed up one last time and filled his lungs with air. And then he made out the cry that the high priest had made at this moment when the last Passover lamb was sacrificed. It is finished. And he bowed his head and he gave up the ghost. And the Gospel of Matthew reads, and the earth quaked, the rocks rent, and the graves of the saints were opened. And when he arose, 3 days and 3 nights later, the saints in the graves arose and appeared to many in the streets of Jerusalem. Wait just a minute. Why is it giving the whole punchline? He just said it is finished. He just died. And then the next statement is, and the earthquake, the graves were open, and when he arose, they arose, is giving us a punchline that he's going to rise 3 days and 3 nights later. Why is this statement there? We're given the punchline all the way in the beginning. Why? Because we are being told that he is fulfilling in every detail now the bikurim of the first fruits. He cried with a loud voice, it is finished, the earthquake, the rocks rent. This is when the high priest was going over with his entourage and binding together the sheaves. The standing omer of barley, the stalks of barley were bound together, and that is when the graves were opened. The first fruits of the dead were being marked. They weren't being cut then. They're just being marked. And they were being marked, and the earth was shaking at the very time that they were binding those standing shocks of barley together. They saw it, the earthquake. They saw those graves open, but nobody came out of them. 3 days and 3 nights later, Yeshua, first of all, gets up on the weekly Sabbath. He is the firstborn from among the dead. Now, when the high priest goes over with his entourage to harvest the barley, that is when Yeshua, who is the high priest after the order of the Melchizedek, that is when he, with the keys of death and the grave, unlocks the grave, and in front of these thousands of Israelites who are there to witness the harvesting of the barley, the first fruits of the barley, they right there in their very presence, that is when Yeshua unlocks the grave, and those saints come out of the grave and appear to many in the streets of Jerusalem. They see it. He, as the high priest, has to be in seclusion until he offers the first fruits before the throne. That morning, he takes the first fruits which he had raised from the dead, right after the sun had set, in the presence of all of these Israelites and the priest over on the side of the Mount of Olives, when he raises them from the dead, the next morning he takes the first fruits from the earth, he ascends up before his Father's throne in heaven and presents the first fruits in heaven, does the wave offering, I'll see you in a few days, Father, and he was back down on the earth to intercept two of his hurt and despondent disciples who had slammed the door in Jerusalem, walked out of Jerusalem during the Feast of Unleavened Bread on the way to Emmaus, and he came up behind them as they were having a very morbid conversation. Disguising himself and said, "Excuse me, gentlemen, what are you so depressed about? What is this, morbid conversation you're having?" And they said, "Are you some kind of stranger around these parts? You've not known the things which have come to pass in these days?" And Yeshua said, "What things? Like he doesn't know?" And so mile after mile, they then rehearsed back to him what had taken place during those days. And Yeshua then asks the questions and draws out every last detail to get them to tell him everything that they saw, everything that had taken place. And finally he stopped and said, "O fools, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Ought not the Messiah to have suffered all these things you've just enumerated and then enter into his glory?" And beginning at Moses and through all the prophets, he then detailed that the Messiah must do all these things. He then detailed that the Messiah had just fulfilled the spring feast of the Lord to the very day, the very hour, the exact moment, in every detail in which we'd rehearsed these things in the feast of the Lord's at Jerusalem. And it says that Yeshua opened their understanding and it changed their life forever. Because they then understood that the Messiah came the first time as a suffering servant, that he came to fulfill the spring feast of the Lord, and he'd done it to the very day, the very hour, the exact moment, in every detail in which we'd rehearsed them. He fulfilled the spring feast of the Lord, including the Bikurim, the first fruit offering, because he raised the dead. When he arose, they arose and appeared to many in the streets.
The resurrection of these saints is part of the fulfillment of the prophetic shadow pictures embedded in the day of Firstfruits. After the Passover lambs were put in the oven, the Kohen Gadol, high priest, and his entourage went over the Kidron Valley bridge to the barley field on the side of the Mount of Olives, opposite the Temple Mount. They bound together 10 standing shocks of Aviv barley, or ripe barley, 1 omer each, and returned to the temple. There, the Kohen Gadol remained in seclusion until the first fruits were harvested, processed, and presented in the temple the following morning. The harvest of the first fruits was done on the failing light after sunset at the end of the weekly Sabbath during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and not after the high Sabbath of Passover, as was instituted by the Pharisees after the destruction of the temple. This is when the saints in the graves arose in sight of thousands who were participated in the harvest of Bikurim, or the day of first fruits. So because of that, I'm going to save this one verse from Matthew, or these two. The graves were opened, the bodies of the saints which slept arose, and came out of the graves after his resurrection, and went into the holy city, and appeared to many. Those two verses I'm going to save until just after he arose, but before he went into heaven. But I will put now the veil of the temple being torn in two. Matthew, and behold, the veil of the temple was rent in two from the top to bottom. And behold. Mark has and the veil, so I could just put behold in there for Matthew. Luke, and the veil. I don't think John has this. The Jews therefore, because it was the preparation that the bodies should not remain upon the cross on the Sabbath day, for that Sabbath day was a high day, besought Pilate that their legs might be broken, and that they might be taken away. So before any of this, where they find out Jesus had already died, I think I should mention that the veil was torn in two, because that happens at the moment he dies. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the veil of the temple being torn in two. Only Matthew has the word behold. Mark has into from the top to the bottom. Matthew has into from the top to the bottom. Luke is in the midst. I don't think I should have in the midst before into. So I'm going to have rent into first. Matthew, Mark was torn into in the midst from top to bottom. Or I could say was torn in two from top to bottom in the midst. I think that should be at the end. From top to bottom in the midst. Yeah, I'll save in the midst from Luke to the very end. Luke, that's the end of the verse. Matthew. Then the earth did quake and the rocks rent. And the graves were opened. That's the end of the verse. Mark. So Matthew, and the earth did quake, and the rocks rent, and the graves were opened.